Question 1.
How does education in the city differ from education in schools in the suburbs?
So one of the things that we don't have in the city is equal funding to what is offered in the suburbs. Chicago Public Schools get 73 cents on the dollar, where schools in the suburbs get $1 on the dollar for funding that is provided for their school or school district. Another thing that the suburbs usually have that the city doesn't have is specialists, like reading specialists and math coaches and math specialists. There's usually just not enough money for city schools to offer those types of services. So you have kids that really need those services that are often put in special ed instead of just simply getting the reading coaches that they need. A lot of the other things are different, like gym classes, where most, if not all, high schools in suburbs have swimming pools, and that's not necessarily true in city schools. There's probably a lot more, but those are the major ones that I can think of right now.
How are private schools' education better or worse than at public schools?
So that's a really interesting question. I think it depends where you're at. That kind of goes along with your question of the difference between city schools and suburban schools. Private schools, if you're talking about schools like religious schools, they usually have a lot smaller classrooms. Their teachers aren't necessarily certified teachers. Sometimes they're just qualified because they have a bachelor's degree in something, so they become teachers in private schools. The difference is funding. Parents obviously have to pay for their kids to go to private schools. One of the good things about private schools is they're usually in the neighborhood, so kids don't have to travel far to go to their private school. Over the past 4 years, we've had over 50 schools closed in Chicago, and so that meant that kids in the neighborhood had to go much farther to get to what would be considered now their neighborhood school. So some of their parents chose to put them in private schools. They were closer to home, they didn't have to cross gang territories, and they had a safe place to be in the neighborhood.
Okay. Do you believe that if a family has more money that their kids should get a better education than people with less money?
So the law says that all kids should have a free, appropriate public education. It doesn't talk about money provided to schools. It just talks about all kids in general. So whatever funding is provided, taken out in taxes, that's supposed to go to the schools, that's what it should be. There should be full funding based on the formulas that states use. Like I said before, Chicago, that's not the case. So should all kids have access to a good quality education? Yes. Should that depend on how much money there is in the city you're living in or the little village you're living in or whatever? I don't think that's necessarily true. If a school has a large amount of funding because they live in an area that they have $1 million homes, or they're just, for whatever reason, they get large amounts of funding because parents donate money or corporations donate money to that school, then that should be taken into account for state funding, and all those schools should be able to get what's equal. In same thing that's in the suburbs, you should be able to get that in other smaller, poorer situations.
Okay. How do people feel about physically disabled people?
The funny thing is that you kind of don't have a choice about what to think about people who have physical disabilities in your school. That's what I'm assuming you're talking about, is people with physical disabilities in your schools. So you don't really have a choice. They have a right by law to get the services they need in order to have access to their education. So I think that, the things that I've seen as far as physical disabilities go, I don't think people have a problem with kids with physical disabilities in their school. The problem becomes when there's not enough funding to make sure that those kids are getting the absolute services they need, like maybe they need a one-on-one aid to help them write, or they need reteaching because they learn a little bit slower. So that all goes into special education funding and funding for people with mental health issues and things like that. Even, no matter what the disability is, people should be able to get a quality education no matter what.
Okay. In schools, how are the physically disabled accommodated?
So it depends, obviously, what the physical disability is. There should be an elevator in every multi-level school to make sure the kids have access to whatever floor they need to get to. Ramps to get into the schools. Tables instead of student desks to make sure that they have something stable to write on and place for their books and place for them to write. And obviously, like I said before, some kids need one-on-one aids to help them with school and doing work, things like that. And just making sure that they have access to the building no matter where they are.
How does the government help people with disabilities and their families?
So there's Social Security funding, Social Security disability insurance it's called. And if you have a child who has a permanent disability that inhibits their quality of life, you can collect on that. The government is responsible for providing funding for people with disabilities of all types. Unfortunately, that funding lately has really gone down the drain. There's all types of funding called Title I, and there's Title III, and all that kind of stuff that usually has to do with funding for people with disabilities. And then, obviously, people with mental health issues, if they need to be in psychiatric floor for a psych stay, something like that, that can, depending upon where you go, that's usually covered by the state if you don't have insurance as well.
Okay. Have you found that the help students with mental illness get is enough? Have you found that the help that they get is enough?
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like what I said before about funding. It always seems like when there are funding issues, the first people that they go after are people with mental health needs or people with disabilities. Special education is unfortunately one of the hot points that people want to get your attention. So they say that they're going to cut special education when the money is short. So do they get the help they need? I guess it depends where they're at. The school that I'm working at right now has over 1,500 students. We have over 200 students with special needs, and that includes mental illness and anxiety, depression, other types of things that you would consider. And we have one social worker for all of those kids that need that help. So it's definitely not enough funding and not enough help out there for kids that really need it.
What does the average person know about mental illness?
Almost nothing. People feel like they know about mental illness by things they see on TV. It depends on what is the hot topic for the season. I remember years ago it was Tourette syndrome, and all the court shows and police TV shows wanted to put somebody on TV that was portraying someone who had Tourette syndrome, when they really only portrayed just a small part of it. At that time, I had a student who had Tourette's, and it was so much more severe and not as stigmatizing as what they wanted to show on TV. But they show you whatever they think is going to get their attention at the time, and then they let it go. So mostly the average person, unless they do their own research and really, really do a good job at it, they don't really know anything about mental illness.
In your work as a special education teacher, have you found mental illness affects your work?
Absolutely. when you say mental illness, though, you're talking about a really broad subject. So it really just depends what you're talking about. ADHD can be considered a mental illness because it's a neurobehavioral disability. But if you're talking about the typical mental illnesses that people usually talk about, like depression, anxiety, things like that, PTSD, it definitely impacts the way that you teach kids. It definitely impacts their education. If you have severe anxiety, a lot of kids with severe anxiety are scared to go to school. A lot of kids with severe depression or post-traumatic stress disorder don't want to leave their houses. And so when they show up to school sporadically, how much can you possibly teach them when you see them maybe once a week or even less? It definitely makes an impact.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.